I remember eating fig Newtons. It's old people's food, something my grandma always had in her cupboards. I would eat whole sleeves of them. She, with her bones thin and hollow as a bird's, dished them up alongside eggs fried in bacon grease and quivering dollops of homemade apple butter. The cellos of moans, I eat eggs and fish, the essentials. The apple trees in my grandparents' backyard seemed constantly, achingly pregnant with fruit. Mamo never called me fat, and for that kindness, sitting at her formica table, I happily spooned my way to my first 20 years of binge-eating. I consumed in totality everything I loved, tubs of buttercream, frosting, all the leftovers of family-sized pizzas, limp and saddled with extra linguiça, always in the early dawn dark before my father's footsteps sent me scurrying back to my room. Jars of Jif by the fingerful, and books, until I didn't. I ate Sylvia Plath's words over and over again, her life, her pains, passions, and madness, long before I knew her in any lit crit sense, in sort of a biblical sense. When you swallow a part of someone, they become a part of you. How much of our disorders, eating and otherwise, are rooted in women, in what we don't realize as children are overt symbols of womanhood, sex, original sin. How much of our disorders stem from our sisters, our mothers' mothers. We are, after all, children of the cursed woman. Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. So here we are, still nicking sweet things when we've been told we shouldn't, lest God slap our hand and banish us from the kitchen. Still tricking men, eating burgers and fries, washing it all down with beer, then excusing ourselves to the toilet so we can remain, remarkably, as we should, a size 0, a nothing. Sylvia, I'm sure, would have been a cool girl, and we all adore and want to be like our cool big sister. I was a cool girl for about 5 years in my 30s when I reached peak starvation. At societally approved perfection. But many experts agree that the forbidden fruit wasn't really an apple. Put aside any doubts or arguments about the reality of the Garden of Eden, I'm with you, I'm a devout agnostic, and consider the facts. The Hebrew word for apple is malum, which sounds very similar to the word evil, malice. It's kind of how February 22nd is Cat Day in Japan. The number 2 in Japanese, ni, sounds a lot like nya, the equivalent of meow. So, nya, meow, 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 and your mouth opens clean as a cat's. Likewise, the evil apple was born. In Hebrew, the words are also nicely alliterative, making apple, malum, choice appealing on a literary level. Michelangelo even painted the tree of knowledge as a fig tree in the Sistine Chapel, but we tend to ignore that detail. Marianne Moore did something similar with wordplay, or at least I think so, in her poem 9 Nectarines, again with the fruits. Chinese porcelain is one of the featured images of the poem, so let's consider the number 9 in Mandarin as well as Chinese culture, where it's deemed auspicious. It's often interpreted to mean enough and perfection. Plus, the number 9 in Mandarin sounds very much like eternity, forever, much like a cat's innate lives. Today, true, we collectively think of the tree of knowledge as an apple tree, but several scholars and rabbis argue irrefutably, no. It was figs. It's always been figs. Sorry, nectarines. Did Sylvia, or Sivvie, as some close friends called her, know that? Did she uncover it in the depths of her Judaic research, perhaps in her college days, when her friend Janet Salter Rosenberg said, "If we were ever in a situation where we didn't want people to know we were referring to ourselves, we would use biblical Jewish names. I would call myself Ruth, and Sylvia liked to use Esther." Personally, I went by Jennifer in such situations, since I was regularly called that anyway. All Jessicas are. For Sylvia, Esther's and Ruth's stalked her throughout her life, or perhaps she manifested them. They persisted from her longtime therapist Ruth Tiffany Buchner, née Barnhouse, to her creation The Bell Jar, protagonist Esther Greenwood, and the Esther in her short story The Mothers' Union, retitled posthumously to Mothers. To the fact that her husband's mistress's middle name was, of course, Esther. Was Judaic truth at the heart of the famed fig tree scene in The Bell Jar? Was she situating herself as a mid-century Eve come Esther, too overwhelmed and hungry to choose just one fruit? I've been there. So hungry or in a binge frenzy that I just couldn't choose. Did I somehow know that? Or are we, women and girls since time immemorial, just inherently drawn to shaking off ignorance, to opening our eyes, our mouths, clean like a cat's? The connections between Sylvia's work and Judaism are deep, winding rabbit holes that can be infinitely explored. The underground channels, the roots, the inverted subterranean branches and reaching fungi are endless. However, one of the most pronounced connections between Sivvie, Judaism, and food and hunger is her preoccupation with Esther's. The biblical Jewish story of Esther centers on food, particularly a series of banquets, or mishteh. Mishteh appears 20 times in the Book of Esther, known as Megillah, or the Scroll, and found in both the Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh Hebrew Bible, but is only found an additional 24 times within the entire remaining Hebrew Bible. The biblical Esther, née Hadassah, was a Jewish Persian orphan raised by her much older cousin, Mordecai. She progresses from being one of King Ahasuerus' many harem girls to his queen thanks to her beauty, which may have been dictated in part by her slenderness, caused by a very sparse diet. She had to conceal her Jewish identity while in the harem for the requisite 12 months, and as such secretly kept a kosher diet. So she wasn't eating much. The Book of Esther opens with Ahasuerus hosting a 180-day feast, followed by a 7-day banquet. Lubavitcher Rebbe calls the opening scene a tale of gross indulgence, saying details of the sheer opulence of these feasts are not spared. Esther wins the king's heart, which calls for yet another banquet that has since been dubbed the Feast of Esther. Soon after, she, still unknown to the king as Jewish, discovers that he's going to allow for a mass genocide of Jews. Mordecai convinces her to ask the king to stop the massacre. Esther agrees, buttering up the king by inviting him to 2 large consecutive dinners. Simultaneously, she asks Mordecai to tell all the Jews to fast for 3 days to prove their religious devotion and appease God. She also fasts immediately before hosting the dinners. This all takes place during Passover, a time when fasting is forbidden. However, when Mordecai objects to fasting on such grounds, Esther convinces him otherwise, saying, "Great sage of Israel, for whom is the Passover? If we will be destroyed, GD," it is increasingly customary to not spell out God in Jewish texts, "forbid, then there will be no Passover. Better we should desecrate one Passover, so that we will be able to fulfill many." Rebbe points out that the prospect of fasting for 3 days consecutively was demanding to the extreme, and was also risky because after 3 days of not eating or drinking, she would no doubt be withered considerably. To be withered would compromise her beauty, her sole bargaining tool. Not too fat, not too thin. In the end, Esther's plan is a success, and it's the foundation for a relatively minor Jewish holiday. Purim is observed in the spring near Easter, or better, Esther, and in contemporary times requires a 1-day sunrise to sunset fast, followed by a large celebratory feast. The fasting portion of Purim is known as the Ta'anit Esther, or Fast of Esther. Biblical Esther's diet has fascinated people for centuries, even leading to contemporary mainstream articles with titles like How to Eat Like Esther. According to David Resnick, the Book of Esther is remarkable for the number and length of feasts and fasts it describes, and the extreme measures described in the story resonates with contemporary eating disorder characteristics. He compares the required gorging and fasting to a mood swing of a holiday, linking Purim specifically to bulimia. In fact, Resnick says that the character of Esther is perfectly drawn in terms of susceptibility of bulimia. Unlike the more common Jewish approach of fasting to get closer to God, much of the Book of Esther focuses on binging, although there's, of course, an element to fasting involved, as there tends to be within the anorexia-bulimia or binge-purge cycle. Resnick compares the patterns of bulimia, gorging alternating with purging and fasting, with the demanded swings of Purim, between fasting and gorging, stating that such mood swings not only parallel the extremes of fasting and gorging, which characterize both bulimia and Purim, but also consistent with the psychological symptoms of bulimia, such as feeling a lack of control over the binging. He stresses that the Book of Esther has evidence of a bulimic episode and not necessarily chronic bulimic behavior, though Esther's situation is tantalizingly suggestive of the factors which presage bulimia. But Sylvia's Esthers don't fast. They are the twinned, indulgent side of her, the feaster. The rampant binging and fasting in the Book of Esther are not the only potential associations with Sylvia's favored name. Rebbe has discussed the Esther versus Hadassah component of the story and suggests that Esther is a name symbolizing concealment, and that she was called Esther because she used to conceal, mysteris, her identity. What was Sylvia hiding within this name? Concealment is a must if a writer wants to conceal elements of her real life, her real self, within her creative works. But hiding is also foundational in eating disorders, just as it can be with stories. I gorged on books, on stories like I did on carbs. By 3rd grade, I was entering oral storytelling contests and winning most, spending hours practicing under my mother's constant unblinking stare until every word was committed to memory, every nuance of enunciation clear of my bastardized Arkansas res accent. These stories were mostly what Westerners called folk tales, because those are what won. But I told them in the way my father and his parents did, the indigenous way. I didn't know this at the time, back when I was instructed, that's just how we do it, we meaning native people. Now what does that mean, to tell stories indigenously? Repetition. Again and again, cyclical as a snake, but some little thing or other might shift, transform. I was drawn to stories that didn't have neat endings and certainly not happily ever afters. I liked the horrific endings, the ambiguous, still do. The ones that just kind of trail off like, that's enough for now. One of my favorite last lines is from Frank Kafka's The Trial, far from his most renowned work, because the final sentence is just, like a dog. How beautiful is that? As Joy Harjo from Muskogee Nation, former U.S. Poet Laureate, describes in her poem Desire's Dog, I too relate to the bitch, especially when it comes to craving. I was Desire's dog. I ate when I was fed. Desire is a bone with traces of fat. I had followed Desire to the end. I didn't know when I first read Kafka about the rumors that he too may have had an eating disorder. Those in this hungry camp of ours just tend to find each other. The last line of The Bell Jar is, the eyes and the faces all turned themselves towards me, and guiding myself by them, as by a magical thread, I stepped into the room. And then, what? Well, whatever it is, I imagine. Sylvia slides it over to me at this point, to all of us. I like the stories that let you guess or infer the ending, no need for tight conclusions wrapped up in little bows. And I'm not alone. In the introduction to the indigenous horror anthology Never Whistle at Night, Stephen Graham Jones, Blackfeet, describes how our stories do that thing Indian stories tend to do, and inconclusively. Which isn't any kind of failure, it's more like a handoff. Here, this is yours now. It lives in your head. And once something's living up there, it tends to stick around, whether it's a good story or a disorder, no matter how much we try to forget. I was a late bloomer when it came to discovering both Sylvia and my own eating disorders. I was equally late beginning the earnest decolonization of my mind, my body, my words, my stories, though this is a lifelong process, as is reading poetry, as is eating disorder management. Sylvia wasn't required reading in school, so I kept myself buried in Stephen King and Dean Koontz while my young metabolism held the excess fat at bay. By 5th grade, a pattern was set. I needed food while reading, like some people need popcorn during a movie. It was a perfect pairing. I spent hours as a preteen on the weekends locked in my room, rereading the sex scenes in horror books like I was studying for an exam. I was a girl. And consuming boxes of hot and spicy Cheez-Its along with a gallon of milk. I would take breaks to sneak into the kitchen, avoiding my always hovering mother, as domineering as Sylvia's, to swipe slices of bread slathered in sandwich spread and piles of American cheese. Mamo had passed by then, and the Fig Newtons, bacony eggs, and apple butter had gone with her, interred to memory. So I regressed to the milk stage of life. Pitcher of milk, now empty.